Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start part 2 of Little Blue Book number 30, and it is titled, What Life Means to Me, written by Jack London, and no copyright date. It seems to be a collection of short stories. I think they may be experiences of Jack London. And I'm not sure when this was originally written, whether it was written specifically for the 10-cent pocket series or the Little Blue Book series, or if it was just a collection. But either way, here we go. Okay, let's see. Let's go back to the beginning of this paragraph that we left off with. Broken down and the garages are all closed. And my wife's somewhere around Truckee, I think, stalled on the overland. Can't get a wire to her for love or money. She should have arrived this evening. She may be starving. Lend me your machine. Can't get it across the bay, Halstead spoke up. The ferries aren't running. But I tell you what you can do. There's Rollinson. Oh, Rollinson. Come here a moment. Atkinson wants to get a machine across the bay. His wife is stuck on the overland at Truckee. Can't you bring the Lorelette across from Tiburon and carry the machine over for him? The Lorette was a 200-ton ocean-going schooner yacht. Rollinson shook his head. He couldn't get a longshoreman to load the machine on board, even if I could get the Lorette over, which I can't, for the crew are members of the Coast Seamen's Union, and they're on strike along with the rest. But my wife may be starving. I could hear Atkinson wailing as I moved on. At the other end of the smoking room, I ran into a group of men bunched excitedly and angrily around Bertie Messner. I forgot we were in a damn building. I thought we were outside again. Bertie Messner, and Bertie was stirring them up and prodding them in his cool, cynical way. Bertie didn't care about the strike. He didn't care much about anything. He was blasé, at least in all the clean things of life. The nasty things had no attraction for him. He was worth 20 millions, all of it in safe investments, and he had never done a tap of productive work in his life. Inherited it all from his father and 2 uncles. He had been everywhere, seen everything, and done everything but get married. And this last in the face of the grim and determined attack of a few hundred ambitious mamas. For years he had been the greatest catch, and as yet he had avoided being caught. He was disgracefully eligible. On top of his wealth, he was young and handsome, and as I said before, clean. He was a great athlete, a young blonde god that did everything perfectly and admirably, with the solitary exception of matrimony. And he didn't care about anything, had no ambitions, no passions, no desire to do the very thing he did so much better than other men. This is sedition, one of the men in the group was crying. Another called it revolt and revolution, and another called it anarchy. I can't see it, Bertie said. I have been out in the streets all morning. Perfect order reigns. I never saw a more law-abiding. Turning of the page. Dun, 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 dun. More law-abiding. I think it's going to be population. Come on now. Come on, you can do it. Yep. A more law-abiding populace. There's no use calling it names. It's not any of these things. It's just what it claims to be, a general strike. And it's your turn to play, gentlemen. And we'll play all right, cried Garfield, one of the traction millionaires. We'll show this dirt where its place is. The beasts! Wait till the government takes a hand. But where is the government? Bertie interposed. It might as well be at the bottom of the sea so far as you're concerned. You don't know what's happening in Washington. You don't know whether you've got a government or not. Don't you worry about that, Garfield blurted out. I assure you I'm not worrying, Bertie smiled languidly. But it seems to me it's what you fellows are doing. Look in the glass, Garfield. Garfield did not look, for he had looked. He would have seen a very excited gentleman with rumpled iron-gray hair, a flushed face, mouth sullen and vindictive, and eyes wildly gleaming. It's not right, I tell you, little Hanover said, and from his tone I was sure that he had already said it a number of times. Now, that's going too far, Hanover, Bertie replied. You fellows make me tired. You're all open shop men. You've eroded my eardrums with your endless gabble for the open shop and the right of a man to work. You've harangued along those lines for years. Labor is doing nothing wrong in going out on this general strike. It is violating no law of God nor man. Don't you talk, Hanover. You've been ringing the changes too long on the God-given right to work. Or not to work. You can't escape the corollary. It's a dirty little sordid scrap, that's all the whole thing is. You've got labor down and gored it. And now labor's got you down and is goring you. That's all. And you're squealing. Every man in the group broke out in indignant denials that labor had ever been gored. No, sir, Garfield was shouting. We've done the best for labor. Instead of gourding it, we've given it a chance to live. We've made work for it. Where would labor be if it hadn't been for us? A whole lot better off, Bertie sneered. You've got labor down and gored it every... Turning to the page. Every time you got a chance, and you went out of your way to make chances. No, no, were the cries. There was the Teamsters strike right here in San Francisco, Bertie went on imperturbably. The Employers Association participated that strike. You know that, and you know I know it too, for I've sat in these rooms and heard the inside talk and news of the fight. First you precipitated the strike. Then you bought the mayor and the chief of police and broke the strike. A pretty spectacle, you philanthropists getting the Teamsters down and goring them. Hold on, I'm not through with you. It's only last year that the labor ticket of Colorado elected a governor. He was never seated, you know why? You know how your brother, philanthropist and capitalist of Colorado, worked it? It was a case of getting labor down and goring it. You kept the president of the Southwestern Amalgamated Association of Miners in a jail for 3 years on trumped-up murder charges. And with him out of the way, you broke up the association. That was goring labor. You'll admit. The third time, the graduated income tax was declared unconstitutional was a gouge. So was the 8-hour bill you killed in the last Congress. And all of the unmitigated immoral gouges, your destruction of the closed shop principle was the limit. You know how it was done. You bought our Farberg, the last president of the old American Federation of Labor. He was your creature, or the creature of all the trust and employers associations, which is the same thing. You precipitated the big closed shop strike. Farberg betrayed that strike. You won, and the old American Federation of Labor crumpled to pieces. You fellows destroyed it, and by so doing undid yourselves. For right on top of it began the organization of the ILW, the biggest and solidest organization of labor the United States has ever seen, and you are responsible for its existence and for the present general strike. You smashed all the old federations and drove labor in the ILW, and the ILW called the general strike, still fighting for the closed shop. And then you have the effrontery to stand here face to face and tell me that you never got labor down and gored it. Ah! This time, there was no denials. Garfield broke out in self-defense. We've done nothing. We were not compelled to do, if you were to win. I'm not saying anything about that, Bertie answered. What I am complaining about is you're squealing now that you're getting a taste of your own medicine. How many strikes have you won by starving labor into submission? Well, labor's worked out a scheme whereby to starve you into submission. It wants to close shop, and if it can get it by starving you, starve you shall. I noticed that you have profited in the past by those very labor gouges you mentioned, insinuated Brentwood, one of the wildest and most astute of our corporation lawyers. The receiver is as bad as the thief, he sneered. You had no hand in the gouging, but you took your whack out of the gouge. That is quite besides the question, Burntwood, Bertie drawled. You're as bad as Hanover, intruding the moral element. I haven't said that anything is right or wrong. It's all rotten game, I know, and my sole kick is that you fellows are squealing now that you're down and labor's taking a gouge out of you. Of course, I've taken the profits from the gouging and, thanks to you gentlemen, without having personally to do the dirty work. You did that for me. Oh, believe me, not because I am more virtuous than you, but because my good father and his various brothers left me a lot of money with which to pay for the dirty work. If you mean to insinuate, Brentwood began hotly. Hold on. Don't get all ruffled up, Bertie interposed insolently. There's no use in playing hypocrite in this thieves' den. The high and lofty is all right for the newspapers, boys, clubs and Sunday schools. That's part of the game. But for heaven's sakes, don't let's play it on one another. You know, and you know I know, just what jobbery was done in the building trades strike last fall. Who put up the money, who did the work, and who profited by it? Brentwood flushed darkly. But we are all tarred with the same brush, and the best thing for us to do is to leave the morality out of it. Again, I repeat, play the game. Play it to the last finish, but for goodness sakes, don't squeal when you get hurt. When I left the group, Bertie was off on a turn of the page, off on a new track, tormenting them with more serious aspects of the situation, pointing out the shortage of supplies that was already making itself felt, and asking them what they were going to do about it. A little later, I met him in the cloakroom, leaving, and gave him a lift home in my machine. It's a great stroke, this general strike, he said, as we bowled along through the crowded but orderly streets. It's a smashing body blow. Labor caught us napping and has struck at our weakest place, the stomach. I'm going to get out of San Francisco, Kerf. Take my advice and get out too. Head for the country, anywhere. You'll have more chance. Buy up a stock of supplies and get into a tent or cabin somewhere. Soon there'll be nothing but starvation in this city for such as we. How correct Bertie Messenger was. I never dreamed. I decided mentally that he was an alarmist. As for myself, I was content to remain and watch the fun. After I dropped him, instead of going directly home, I went on in a hunt for more food. To my surprise, I learned that the small groceries where I had bought in the morning were sold out. I extended my search to the Potterio, and by good luck managed to pick up another box of candles, 2 sacks of wheat flour, 10 pounds of graham flour, which would do for the servants, a case of tinned corn, and 2 cases of tinned tomatoes. It did look as though there was going to be at least a temporary food shortage, and I hugged myself over the goodly stock of provisions I had laid in. The next morning, I had my coffee, in bed as usual, and more than the cream, I missed the daily paper. It was this absence of knowledge of what was going on in the world that I found the chiefest hardship. Down at the club, there was little news. Ryder had crossed from Oakland in his launch, and Halstead had been down to San Jose and back in his machine. They reported the same condition in those places as in San Francisco. Everything was tied up by the strike. All grocery stocks had been bought out by the upper classes, and perfect order reigned. But what was happening over the rest of the country? In Chicago, New York, Washington? Most probably the same things that were happening with us, we concluded. But the fact that we did not know with absolute surety was irritating. General Folsom had a bit of news. An attempt had been made to place Army telegraphers in the telegraph offices, but the wires had been cut in every direction. This was, so far, the one unlawful act committed by labor, and that it was a concerted act, he was fully convinced. He had communicated by wireless with the Army post at Benicia, Benicia, Benicia? I don't know. The telegraph lines were even then being patrolled by soldiers all the way to Sacramento. Once, for one short instant, they had got the Sacramento call. Then the wires somewhere were cut again. General Folsom reasoned that similar attempts to open communication were being made by the authorities all the way across the continent, but he was non-committal as to whether or not he thought the attempt would succeed. What worried him was the wire cutting. He could not but believe that it was an important part of the deep-laid labor conspiracy. Also, he regretted that the government had not long since established its projected chain of wireless stations. The days came and went, and for a time it was a humdrum time. Nothing happened. The edge of excitement had become blunted. The streets were not so crowded. The working class did not come uptown anymore to see how we were taking the strike, and there was not so many automobiles running around. The repair shops and garages were closed, and whenever a machine broke down, it went out of commission. The clutch on mine broke, and love nor money could not get it repaired. Like the rest, I now was walking. San Francisco lay dead, and did we not know what was happening over the rest of the country? But from the very fact that we did not know, we could conclude only that the rest of the country lay as dead as San Francisco. From time to time, the city was placarded with the proclamations of organized labor. These had been printed months before in evidence how thoroughly the ILW had prepared for the strike. Every detail had been worked out long in advance. No violence had occurred as yet, with the exception of the shooting of a few wire cutters by the soldiers. But the people of the slums were starving and growing ominously restless. The businessmen, the millionaires, and the professional class held meetings and passed proclamations. But there was no way of turning the page. No way of making the proclamation public. They could not even get them printed. One result of these meetings, however, was that General Folsom was persuaded into taking military possession of the wholesale houses and of all the flour, grain, and food warehouses. It was high time, for suffering was becoming acute in the homes of the rich, and bread lines were necessary. I know that my servants were beginning to draw long faces, and it was amazing the hole they made in my stock of provisions. In fact, as I afterwards surmised, each servant was stealing from me and secreting a private stock of provisions for himself. No shit, Sherlock. But with the formation of the bread lines came new troubles. There was only so much of a food reserve in San Francisco, and at the best it could not last long. Organized labor, we knew, had its private supplies. Nevertheless, the whole working class joined the bread lines. As a result, the provisions General Folsom had taken possession of diminished with perilous rapidity. How were the soldiers going to distinguish between a shabby middle-class man, a member of the ILW, or a slum dweller? The first and the last had to be fed, but the soldiers did not know all the ILW men in the city, much less the wives and sons and daughters of the ILW men. The employers, helping a few of the known Union men, were flung out of the bread lines, but that amounted to nothing. To make matters worse, the government tugs that had been hauling food from the army depots on Mare Island to Angel Island found no more food to haul. The soldiers had received their rations from the confiscated provisions, and they received them first. The beginning of the end was in sight. Violence was beginning to show its awful face. Law and order was passing away and passing away. I must confess, among the slum people and the upper classes, organized labor still maintained perfect order. It could well afford to. It had plenty to eat. I remember the afternoon at the club when I caught Halstead and Brentwood whispering in a corner. They took me in on a venture. Brentwood's machine was still in running order, and they were going out cow stealing. Halstead had a long butcher knife and a cleaver. We went out to the outskirts of the city. Here and there were cows grazing, but always guarded by their... Going to steal a cow, for crying out loud. Guarded by their owners. We pursued our quest, following along the fringe of the city to the east, and on the hills near Hunter's Point, we came upon a cow guarded by a little girl. There was also a young calf with the cow. We wasted no time on preliminaries. The little girl ran away screaming while we slaughtered the cow. I omit the details, for they are not nice. That was nice of them. We were accustomed to such work, and we were unaccustomed to such work, and we bungled it. But in the midst of it, working with the haste of fear, we heard cries, and we saw the number of men running towards us. We abandoned the spoils and took to our heels. To our surprise, we were not pursued. Looking back, we saw the men hurriedly cutting up the cow. They had been on the same lay as ourselves. We argued that there was plenty for all, and ran back. The scene that followed beggars description. We fought and squabbled over the division like savages. Brentwood, I remember, was a perfect brute, snarling and snapping and threatening that murder would be done if we did not get our proper share. And we were getting our share when there occurred a new eruption on the scene. This time, it was the dreaded peace officers of the ILW. The little girl had brought them. They were armed with whips and clubs, and there was a score of them. The little girl danced up and down in anger, the tears streaming down her cheeks, crying, "Give it to him! Give it to him! That guy with the specs, he did it. Mash his face for him. Mash his face!" The guy with the specs was I, and I got my face mashed, too. Though I had the presence of mind to take off my glasses at the first. My, but we did receive a trouncing as we scattered in all directions. Brentwood, Halstead, and I flew away for the machine. Brentwood's nose was bleeding, while Halstead's cheek was cut across with a scarlet slash of a black snape whip. And lo, when the pursuit ceased and we had gained the machine, there hiding behind it was the frightened calf. Brentwood warned us to be cautious and crept up on it like a wolf or tiger. Knife and cleaver had been left behind, but Brentwood still had his hands, and over on the ground he rolled with the poor little calf as he throttled it. We threw the carcass into the machine, covered it over with a robe, and started home. But our misfortunes had only begun. We blew out a tire. There was no way of fixing it, and twilight was coming on. We abandoned the machine, Brentwood puffing and staggering along in advance, the calf, covered by the robe, slung across his shoulders. We took turn about carrying that calf, and it nearly killed us. Also, we lost our way. And then, after hours of wandering and toil, we encountered a gang of hoodlums. They were not ILW men, and I guess they were as hungry as we. At any rate, they got the calf, and we got the thrashing. Brentwood raged like a madman the rest of the way home, and he looked like one, what in his torn clothes, swollen nose, and blackened eyes. There wasn't any more cow stealing after that. Guess not, huh? General Folsom sent his troops out and confiscated all the cows, and his troopers, aided by the militia, ate most of the meat. General Folsom was not to be blamed. It was his duty to maintain law and order, and he maintained it by means of the soldiers. Wherefore he was compelled to feed them first of all. It was about this time that the great panic occurred. The wealthy classes precipitated the fight, and then the slum people caught caught the contagion and stampeded wildly out of the city. General Folsom was pleased. It was estimated that at least 200,000 had deserted San Francisco, and by that much of his food problem was solved. Well, do I remember that day? Well, do I remember that day? In the morning, I had eaten a crust of bread. Half of the afternoon, I had stood in the bread line, and after dark, I returned home, tired and miserable, carrying a quart of rice and a slice of bacon. Brown met me at the door. His face was worn and terrified. All the servants had fled, he informed me. He alone remained. I was touched by his faithfulness, and when I learned that he had eaten nothing all day, I divided my food with him. We cooked half the rice and half the bacon, sharing it equally and reserving the other half for morning. I went to bed with my hunger and tossed restlessly all night. In the morning I found Brown had deserted me. In greater misfortune still, he had stolen what remained of the rice and bacon. It was a gloomy handful of men that came together at the club that morning. There was no service at all. The last servant was gone. I noticed, too, that the silver was gone, and learned where it had gone. The servants had not taken it, for the reason, I presume, that the club members got it first. Their method of disposing of it was simple. Down south of Market Street in the dwellings of the ILW, the housewives had given square meals in exchange for it. I went back to my house. Yes, my silver was gone, all but a massive pitcher. This I wrapped up and carried down south of Market. I felt better after the meal, and returned to the club to learn if there was anything new in the situation. Hanover, Collins, and Dakin were just leaving. There was no one inside, they told me, and they invited me to come along with them. They were leaving the city, they said, on Dacon's horses, and there was a spare one for me. Dacon had 4 magnificent carriage horses that he wanted to save, and General Folsom had given him the tip that next morning all the horses that remained in the city were to be confiscated for food. There were not many horses left, for tens of thousands of them had been turned loose into the country when the hay and grain gave out during the first days. Birdall, I remember, who had great draying interest, had turned loose 300 dray horses, at an average value of $500. This had amounted to 150,000. He had hoped at first to recover most of the horses after the strike was over, but in the end he never recovered one of them. They were all eaten by the people that fled from San Francisco. For that matter, the killing of the army mules and horses for food had already begun. Fortunately for Dacon, he had a plentiful supply of hay and grain stored in his stable. We managed to raise 4 saddles, and we found the animals in good condition and spirited, with all unused of being ridden. I remember the San Francisco of the great earthquake as we rode through the streets, but this San Francisco was vastly more pitiable. No cataclysm of nature had caused this, but rather the tyranny of the labor unions. We rode down past Union Square and through the theater, hotel and shopping districts. The streets were deserted. Here and there stood automobiles, abandoned where they had broken down or when the gasoline had given out. There was no sign of life, save for the occasional policemen and the soldiers guarding the banks and public buildings. Once we came upon an ILW man pasting up the latest proclamation. We stopped to read. "We have maintained an orderly strike," it ran, "and we shall maintain order to the end. The end will come when our demands are satisfied, and our demands will be satisfied when we have starved our employers into submission, as we ourselves in the past have often been starved into submission." Mesner's very words, Collins said. "And I, for one, am ready to submit. Only they won't give me a chance to submit. I haven't had a full meal in an age. I wonder what horse meat tastes like." We stopped to read another proclamation. "When we think our employers are ready to submit, we shall open up the telegraphs and place the Employers Associations of the United States in communication, but only messages relating to peace terms shall be permitted over the wires. We rode on. Crossed Market Street, and a little later were passing through the working class district. Here the streets were not deserted. Leaning over gates or standing in groups were the ILW men. Happy, well-fed children were playing games, and stout housewives sat on the front steps gossiping. One and all cast amused glances at us. Little children ran after us, crying, "Hey, mister, aren't you hungry?" And one woman, a nursing child at her breast, called at Dacon, "Say, fatty, I will give you a square meal for your skate. Ham and potatoes, currant jelly, white bread, canned butter, and 2 cups of coffee." "Have you noticed the last few days," Hanover remarked to me, "that there's not been a stray dog in the streets?" I had noticed, but I had not thought about it before. It was high time to leave the unfortunate city. We at last managed to connect with the San Bruno road, along which we headed south. I had a country place near Menlo, and it was our objective. But soon we began to discover that the country was worse off and far more dangerous than the city. There, the soldiers in the ILW kept order. Let's see, turn the page. Well, let's see. That may be where I stop for part 2. Let me see, how many pages do we have left? Let's see. 45 to 54. I think we'll have to continue reading. Just because there's less than 10 pages left, so. All right, here we go. Oops. Caught mouth. Let's induce more. Okay. But the country had been turned. Okay. Nope. Yep. Let me make sure. Yep. The soldiers in the ILW kept order. But the country had been turned over to anarchy. 200,000 people had fled south from San Francisco, and we had countless evidences that their flight had been like that of an army of locusts. They had swept everything clean. There had been robbery and fighting. Here and there we passed bodies on the roadside and saw the blackened ruins of farmhouses. The fences were down, and the crops had been trampled by the feet of multitudes. All the vegetable patches had been rooted up by the famished hordes. All the chickens and farm animals had been slaughtered. This is true of all the main roads that led out of San Francisco. Here and there, away from the roads, farmers had held their own with shotguns and revolvers, and were still holding their own. They warned us away and refused to parley with us. And all the destruction and violence had been done by the slum dwellers and the upper classes. The ILW men, with plentiful food supplies, remained quietly in their homes in the cities. Early in the day, we received concrete proof of how desperate was the situation. To the right of us, we heard cries and rifle shots. Bullets whistled dangerously near. There was a crashing in the underbrush. Then a magnificent black truck horse broke across the road in front of us and was gone. We had barely time to notice that he was bleeding and lame. He was followed by 3 soldiers. The chase went on amongst the trees on the left. We could hear the soldiers calling to one another. A 4th soldier limped out upon the road from the right, sat down on a boulder, and mopped the sweat from his face. The man grinned up at us and asked for a match. In reply to Decon's "What's the word?" he informed us that the militiamen were deserting. "No grub," he exclaimed. "They're feeding it all to the regulars." We also learned from him that the military prisoners had been released from the Alcatraz island because they could no longer be fed. I shall never forget the next sight we encountered. We came upon it abruptly, around a turn of the road. Overhead arched the trees. The sunshine was filtering down through the branches. Butterflies were fluttering by, and from the fields came the song of larks. And there it stood, a powerful touring car. About it and in it lay a number of corpses. It told its own tale. Its occupants, fleeing from the city, had been attacked and dragged down by a gang of slum dwellers, hoodlums. The thing had occurred within 24 hours. Freshly opened meat and fruit tins explained the reason for the attack. Dacon examined the bodies. "I thought so," he reported. "I've ridden in that car. It was Periton. The whole family. We've got to watch out for ourselves from now on." "But we had no food with which to invite attack," I objected. Dacon pointed to the horse I rode, and I understood. Early in the day, Dacon's horse had cast a shoe. The delicate hoof had split, and by noon the animal was limping. Dacon refused to ride it further and refused to desert it. So, on his solicitation, we went on. He would lead the horse and join us at my place. That was the last we saw of him, nor did we ever learn his end. By 1 o'clock we arrived at the town of Menlo, or rather at the site of Menlo, for it was in ruins. Corpses lay everywhere. The business part of the town, as well as part of the residences, had been gutted by fire. Here and there residents still held out, but there was no getting near them. When we approached too closely, we were fired upon. We met a woman who was poking about in the smoking ruins of her cottage. The first attack, she told us, had been on the stores, and as she talked, we could picture that raging, roaring, hungry mob flinging itself upon the handful of townspeople. Millionaires and paupers who fought side by side for the food and then fought with one another after they got it. The town of Palo Alto, and Sanford University had been sacked in similar fashion. We learned ahead of us lay a desolate wasteland, and we thought we were wise in turning off to my place. It lay 3 miles to the west, snuggling among the first rolling swells of the foothills. But as we rode along, we saw that the devastation was not confined to the main roads. The van of the flight had kept to the roads, sacking the small towns as it went, while those that followed had scattered out and swept the whole countryside like a great broom. My place was built of concrete, masonry, and tiles, and so had escaped being burned, but it was gutted clean. We found the gardener's body in the windmill, littered around with empty shotgun shells. He had put up a good fight, but no trace could be found of the 2 Italian laborers, nor of the housekeeper and her husband. Not a living thing remained. The calves, the colts, all the fancy poultry, and the thoroughbred stock, everything was gone. The kitchen and the fireplace where the mob had cooked were a mess, while many campfires outside bore witness to the large number that had fed and spent the night. What they had not eaten, they had carried away. There was not a bite for us. We spent the rest of the night vainly waiting for Dacon, and in the morning, with our revolvers, fought off 6 marauders. Then we killed one of Dacon's horses, hiding for the future what meat we did not immediately eat. In the afternoon, Collins went out for a walk, but failed to return. This was the last straw to Hanover. He was for flight, he was for flight there and then. There we go. And I had great difficulty in persuading him to wait for daylight. As for myself, I was convinced that the end of the general strike was near, and I was resolved to return to San Francisco. So, in the morning we parted company. Hanover heading south, 50 pounds of horse meat strapped to his saddle, while I, similarly loaded, headed north. Little Hanover pulled through all night, and to the end of his life he will persist, I know, in boring everybody with a narrative of his subsequent adventures. I got as far as Belmont, on the main road back, when I was robbed of my horse meat by 3 militiamen. There was no change in the situation, they said, except that it was going from bad to worse. The ILW had plenty of provisions hidden away and could last out of months. I managed to get as far as Baden, when my horse was taken away from me by a dozen men. 2 of them were San Francisco policemen, and the remainder were regular soldiers. This was ominous. The situation was certainly extreme when the regulars were beginning to desert. When I continued my way on foot, they already had the fire started, and the last of Dacon's horses lay slaughtered on the ground. As luck would have it, I sprained my ankle and succeeded in getting no further than South San Francisco. I lay there that night in an outhouse, shivering with the cold, and at the same time burning with fever. 2 days I lay there, too sick to move, and on the third, reeling and giddy, supporting myself on the extemporized crutch, I tottered on toward San Francisco. I was weak as well, for it was the 3rd day since food had passed my lips. It was a day of nightmare and torment. As in a dream, I passed hundreds of regular soldiers drifting along in the opposite direction, and many policemen with their families organized in large groups for mutual protection. As I entered the city, I remembered the workman's house at which I had traded the silver pitcher, and in that direction my hunger drove me. Twilight was falling when I came to the place. I passed around by the alleyway and crawled up the back steps on which I had collapsed. I managed to reach out with a crutch and knock at the door. Then I must have fainted, for I came to in the kitchen, my face wet with water, and whiskey being poured down my throat. I choked and sputtered and tried to talk. I began by saying something about not having any more silver pitchers, but that I would make it up for them afterward if they would only give me something to eat. But the housewife interrupted me. "Why, you poor man," she said. "Haven't you heard? The strike was called off this afternoon. Of course we'll give you something to eat." She hustled around, opening a tin of breakfast bacon and preparing to fry it. "Let me have some now, please," I begged, and I ate the raw bacon on a slice of bread, while her husband explained that the demands of the ILW had been granted. The wires had been opened up in the early afternoon, and everywhere the Employers Association had given in. There hadn't been any employers left in San Francisco, but General Folsom had spoke for them. The trains and steamers would start running in the morning, and so would everything else just as soon as systems could be established. And that was the end of the general strike. I never want to see another one. It was worse than in war. A general strike is a cruel and immoral thing, and the brain of man should be capable of running industry in a more rational way. Harrison is still my chauffeur. It was part of the conditions of the ILW that all of its members should be reinstated in their old positions. Brown never came back, but the rest of the servants are with me. I haven't the heart to discharge them, poor creatures. They were pretty hard pressed when they deserted with the food and silver, and now I can't discharge them. They have all been unionized by the ILW. The tyranny of organized labor is getting beyond human endurance. Something must be done. That's the end of What Life Means to Me by Jack London. Little Blue Book number 30. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.